When it comes to diet, there's so much discussion about which macronutrient you ought to minimize and which one you ought to increase. There's discussions about low carb, there's discussions about low fat, there's discussions about high protein diets. But if you look at the evidence, what we consistently find is that a whole foods, plant-based diet is the ideal diet for your overall health. But what about weight loss? And do we have a randomized clinical trial, which is the gold standard when it comes to looking at this stuff, to be able to answer the question that is a low-fat, high-carbohydrate, which is the definition of a whole foods plant-based diet, is that effective when it comes to weight loss? There are lots of benefits to a whole foods plant-based diet. When you look at the evidence, you find that those consuming a predominantly whole foods plant-based diet have blood pressures that are lower by about 5 points compared to those who eat a predominantly meat-based diet. Even if you look at the risk of heart disease, for example, people who follow a whole foods plant-based diet have a 16% lower risk of developing heart disease, and their risk of dying from heart disease is lower by 31%. And if you look at things like memory, so dementia, cognitive decline as we continue to age, the risk of that getting worse is lower by 13% in those who follow a plant-based diet. But what about a low-fat, vegan, which is essentially a whole foods plant-based diet, when it comes to weight loss? So here's a 16-week randomized clinical trial with a control arm that had 244 participants. Now, these folks were anywhere between 25 years old to 75 years old. BMIs, they're considered to be overweight all the way over to the obese category, so BMI of 28 to 40, and they were randomized to 2 arms. The first arm was a low-fat vegan arm, and what that essentially meant was they ate about 75% carbohydrates, 15% protein, and 10% fat. The second arm was the control arm, and that one, really, they gave them no instructions and no dietary changes. They could eat the way they did. Remember, these guys are not vegan going into these studies. These are randomly selected. So what did they find? Well, here's where it becomes really interesting. In the vegan arm, over 16 weeks, the participants had a weight loss of 14 pounds. That is impressive, 14 pounds in 4 months. That's without surgery, that's without any sort of medications. In the control arm, where they weren't given any instructions on what to do, they lost about 1 pound. And if we look at the calorie intake, remember, a whole foods plant-based diet is high in fiber. As a result of it, it has a filling effect on folks. So you tend to consume less calories overall, and that's what this study, along with previous data, also showed. So what they found was that the vegan group was actually consuming, not because they were told to, but they were consuming about 355 calories less per day. And the control group was consuming about 135 less. But that difference alone isn't enough to explain why the weight loss. The other thing that was really interesting was the fiber content. So in the plant-based group, their fiber intake actually increased by 11 grams per day, versus in the control group, it went down a little bit. Essentially, it was the same. But what's fascinating is a whole foods plant-based diet is naturally rich in fiber. Then the other part of this, which becomes really fascinating, is what happened to things like fat inside the liver, fat inside the muscles. So when they looked at the control group and they looked at liver fat, there really wasn't a big difference from where they started from. In fact, if anything, the liver fat actually increased a little bit. But in the treatment arm, in the whole foods plant-based arm, the liver fat went down, and it went down significantly. Same thing when they looked at the fat inside the muscles, what they saw was that in the low-fat, whole foods diet arm, the amount of fat inside the muscles actually went down. So really, what is the take-home from this study, and what can you do right now? If you're worried about losing weight and you say low carb is the only way to go, what this study clearly shows, and this is a randomized clinical trial, is that you can follow a whole foods plant-based diet and have wonderful results, not only for your heart health, for your brain health, for your blood pressures, we've talked about for your kidneys, but also for weight loss and fat loss. And that's remarkable that When we talk about things like high carbohydrates, this can be beneficial. And remember, when we talk about high carbohydrates, we're not talking about potato chips. We're not talking about essentially simple carbohydrates. A whole foods plant-based diet is minimally processed foods. So that's things like sweet potatoes, whole grains, lentils, right? All those things that are wonderful for your health that you ought to be eating, fruits, veggies. So as always, thanks so much for watching. Please don't forget to share, don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe, and don't forget to comment. I would love to hear what your thoughts on this video are and what topics you'd like to see next time.